Hi, Kristoffer.
Hey Nate, how are you?
Doing well. You?
Good.
Good. So I thought it'd be good to start by introducing ourselves, and then we can get straight to the material.
Sure. So why don't I start? So I'm Kristoffer Ahlstrom-Vij. I'm lecturer in philosophy at the University of Kent in Canterbury, UK. Passing back to you, Nate.
Yes, I'm Nathan King, assistant professor of philosophy at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. Now, Kristoffer, we've both done some work on intellectual virtue and virtue epistemology. I thought it might be good if we started by talking a little bit about sort of what got us into this topic.
Sounds great. So I work in the intersection between social epistemology and virtue epistemology, and I came to virtue epistemology as someone working on questions about knowledge from a social perspective. So if we think about traditional virtue epistemology, the picture that we get of the knowledge seeker, if you will, is an individual, intellectually courageous, virtuous person going at it alone and succeeding, hopefully, from some kind of inherent character virtue. Now, that's a very different picture, of course, from the one we have when we think about, say, doing science. Science is an inherently social discipline. We rely on others not just in science, but in all kinds of inquiry. We rely on others for all kinds of different things that we know. So I was interested in this tension is too strong a word, but in this difference of perspective between social epistemology on the one hand and virtue epistemology on the other. And I was interested in particular about what, for example, virtue epistemology might be able to learn from social epistemology, and of course, vice versa. That's what brought me to think about virtue epistemology and intellectual virtue in particular. So how about you, Nate? So what made you interested in intellectual virtue?
Yeah, so a number of things, among them sort of pedagogical interests. As I thought about the kind of intellectual virtue that's a character trait, a cognitive character trait that involves sort of motivation for intellectual goods. So I'm thinking of intellectual virtues like open-mindedness, intellectual courage, fairness, charity, virtues like this. Those are really the traits that I'm hoping my students will develop as they go through their education. So initially I thought there'd be some pedagogical benefit from thinking about the intellectual virtues. Another thing is, as I looked at kind of key examples in the history of inquiry, so people like Newton and Einstein, I found that it seemed like the story of the intellectual virtues was largely responsible for the story of their success, or at any rate, it was an important component of their success. So I thought there would be some interesting tie-ins between what's going on in virtue epistemology and sort of explanations of success in the history of inquiry.
Excellent. So you've done some work on intellectual perseverance in particular. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about what made you interested in that virtue in particular.
Yeah. So one thing is, as I looked at the literature, sort of a lot of the other virtues had been explored significantly. So there's a literature on courage, for instance. There's a literature on open-mindedness and so forth. So it looked like there was, room for work on this other virtue, perseverance. And so I thought that might be a helpful discussion to begin to develop. Another issue is that as I looked at specific instances of success in the history of inquiry, so Newton and Einstein in particular, it looked like perseverance played a key role in cognitive success. So, what's the best known biography of Newton? It's entitled Never at Rest, right? Perseverance is crucial to his success. Or if you think about Einstein, though he's of course brilliant, he attributes a lot of his success to perseverance. He even says, it's not that I'm so much smarter than everyone else, it's just that I stick at the questions a lot longer. So it seemed to me that there were some interesting sort of historical tie-ins to develop alongside the conceptual analysis of perseverance. And Kristoffer, you've done some work on deference, and in particular blind deference as a virtue. Maybe you'd want to say a bit about that to start us off.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it goes back to what I mentioned a moment ago about coming to virtue epistemology from social epistemology, and thinking in particular about, so there's obviously this thing that we often do and often need to do when we try to come to know things, and that is we defer to others. We listen to other people, and hopefully we're listening to people who know what they're talking about, and typically know more than we do. That's why we defer to them. And it moreover seems that you can do that in ways that will reflect well on your character, and you can do it in ways that reflect badly on your character. So it seems that there should be something like a virtue of deference in this neighborhood of what we do. And I was interested, as a social epistemologist, to see exactly how far you could push this virtue towards some kind of completely blind deference. We have someone simply soaking up everything that they're hearing. And whether it might even be the case, and I've tried to argue that it is the case, that even in that extreme kind of case where we have a completely blind form of deference, there can be a virtue. There can be a virtue of blind deference. And I have some things to say about exactly what kind of virtue that will be that we might want to get to later. But that's the line of thought that made me interested in the virtue of deference in particular.
Okay, terrific. Maybe we can talk about that a bit more. So you have this paper entitled The Social Virtue of Blind Deference, and you argue for a couple of main claims in that paper related to this virtue. I wonder if you can maybe unpack those, and then we'll sort of take it
Sure,
from there.
yeah. No, what I do in the paper, one thing that I do in the paper, I start out with this, we want kind of a paradigmatic case of something that surely would have to be virtuous deference. So we imagine a person called Larry in the paper, just to be able to refer to the person in an easy way. So we imagine that Larry he's motivated to attain true belief for its own sake. So he has the kind of epistemic motivation, if you want, that a lot of people working in virtue epistemology think is crucial to having virtue, that you're motivated in an appropriate manner. Of course, an idea going back to Aristotle. So we imagine that he has this kind of motivation, and we more imagine that he's diligent in the way that he vets his fellow inquirers for trustworthiness before taking on board what they're telling him. And finally, we can assume that his sources are, in fact, reliable sources on the relevant matter. They're not the kind of sources that will lead him astray. So what I suggest in the paper is that, so if there is such a thing as a virtue of deference, and I think it's plausible to think that there is, surely this would have to be a kind of virtue had by Larry in this kind of situation. So what I do in parts of the remainder of the paper is I try to strip away aspects of this kind of scenario to see exactly how much we can take away without losing the knowledge of virtue had by Larry. So we can start by removing this motivation, this epistemic motivation for attaining something like true belief for its own sake. And I argue that in itself will not remove whatever virtue we're going to want to say that Larry has, and the reason is simple. So if you think about seem to have this kind of motivation present. So think about when we perceive things and come to know things as a result. I can look out at the tree outside of my office, and I will come to know that there is a tree outside on the basis of perceiving. But it seems a stretch to say that there is some kind of motivation for truth as such involved in that kind of knowledge. Nevertheless, it seems that I can instantiate some kind of virtue in so doing. So virtue epistemology can respond in different ways, but the most popular, I think, and present way to handle that kind of case is to say, sure, there's a kind of virtue you can have in that kind of situation. It might not be what some virtue epistemists want to call character virtue, which is something that you all already referred to. So for character virtue, we need to have this kind of motivation. But there might be other kind of virtues, such as more kind of basic, I don't know what word to use, basic virtue we can have in say, perceptual cases. So, in other words, the upshot of this is just that you can remove this motivation from the case involving Larry and still have a kind of virtue. And then you can keep stripping away aspect of the case on the same line. So you can think about, so one thing we assumed too was that Larry is vetting his sources for trustworthiness. So why is that a good thing, we might ask? Well, if we ask an epistemologist like Lizzie Fricker, she would say, well, if you don't do that, then you're gullible, right? So then we ask Fricker, so what exactly does it mean to be gullible? And then she ends up spelling it out as involving roughly that you are likely to take on board true beliefs. But of course, that's not a worry for Larry, because remember, we assumed he's deferring to people that are reliable. So by simply taking aboard what he's telling them, he's unlikely to acquire false beliefs. In other words, he's not going to be gullible this way, even if he were to not be vetting his fellow inquirers for trustworthiness before taking on board what they're saying. So it seems we can remove this aspect too. We can remove this vetting aspect of he's being vigilant in the relevant way. Now, then we can keep looking at further consideration. It might be maybe some virtue epistemologists have wanted to say, well, it's not just being reliable that matters. It also needs to be the case that you forming true belief or achieving some kind of epistemic success, or whatever you want to frame it, it needs to be to your credit in some way. And we might suggest that, sure, Larry might be forming true belief, or at least be unlikely to form a false belief, but it's not really to his credit. It's to the credit of his epistemic surroundings, so to speak. But then when we look closer at what the relevant virtue epistemologists, these are people like Greco and Sosa and Riggs, what they mean when they say it has to be something that you can get credit for, really what they're talking about is the kind of stuff that rules out you being lucky, right? So say that, for example, if I form belief by way of some unreliable process, the kind of process that is likely to land me in a false belief, if I form a true belief, nevertheless, there's a sense in which I just got lucky, right? So that's the kind of stuff they want to rule out by talking about credits. But of course, that's also not a worry for Larry, because his sources are reliable. So him simply taking on board whatever they're telling him is not something, it's not just a matter of luck that he gets it right. So in other words, credit doesn't seem to be an issue too. Now, and then I discussed a number of other aspects that we can be stripping away. We don't have to go into them in detail because it can get a bit tedious. But it's the same kind of line of reasoning, that it seems that we can strip away all these things without it being the case that Larry comes out as no longer knowing the things that the people that he's deferring to is telling him. Now, what does this have to do with virtue? Well, there is this assumption in virtue epistemology, or so I argue, to the effect that all instances of knowledge have to be accounted for in terms of virtues. So I call this universalism, right? Now, that might seem a very strong assumption to make about what virtue epistemology should be doing. But in fact, so going back to the kind of stuff where we talked about perceptual knowledge, it's one that it actually seems that a great majority of virtue epistemologists want to make. They want to make that assumption of universalism. And why is that? Well, think about, I said something about how virtue epistemologists tend to respond to the objection by some people when they say, well, look, you can know all these things without having the relevant epistemic motivation. Well, what they say is that either they try to squeeze it into the motivation box and say, well, you just think you're just packing too much stuff into the relevant notion of motivation, or they might be saying, as I suggest more people tend to say nowadays, is that, well, there might be several kinds of virtue, and there is going to be a virtue that captures the kind of knowledge you have in cases of perceptual knowledge. Now, what they don't say, and this is the crucial piece of evidence for me, no one really says, well, I never claimed that I was supposed to be counting for all kinds of knowledge, right? So that's evidence that the fact that no one is making that argument is evidence that people are actually implicitly assuming universalism. So the importance of that assumption for me is that it entails that, well, if you have knowledge, there has to be a virtue there, right? So I strip away all these aspects of the Larry case, stripping away each individual one that doesn't rob them of knowledge. So when we get all the way down to the blind deference case, where he's just soaking everything up that people are telling him, we still have knowledge, which means that we must still have virtue. So that's why I argue that there seems to have to be, given the assumptions that virtue epistemologists make, something like a virtue of blind deference. And then in the remainder of the paper, I try to spell out what kind of virtue that is. I argue that it's a kind of social virtue. It's a virtue had not on account of factors internal to the psychology of Larry in this case, the individual agent, but rather factors pertaining to his social surrounding, and specifically that he happens to be surrounded by a bunch of reliable sources. So that's roughly the line of argument I have for suggesting that there is a virtue of blind deference.
Okay, great. So it sounds to me like if we could just kind of recapitulate these claims and make sure I've got them right, you think that first, everybody thinks there's some kind of virtue of deference, or cases in which deference is virtuous. And your initial thought, or the thought that you develop, your first thesis is something like this. If you grant that, then you're going to have to grant that there's also a virtue of blind deference. Is that good so far? And then later in the paper, you argue that in order to make sense of blind deference as a virtue, we have to develop and import this notion of a social virtue, which has been not discussed a great deal in the literature. Great. So some questions on the paper. So when I first started thinking about this case of Larry's blind deference, I was wondering about this detail that I didn't hear. Maybe it just slipped past me. So I'm wondering, do we agree maybe Larry doesn't have to vet his sources in order to have knowledge? Question, would he vet his sources? Would he sort of check them out if signs of trouble arose? So now two ways it could go. If you say, no, he wouldn't vet those sources even at the sign of trouble, then it might look like Larry's blind deference isn't virtuous. If, on the other hand, he would vet those sources at a sign of trouble, maybe a sign of unreliability, then it looks like his virtuous deference might not be blind. So I wonder what you have to say about that.
That's a really good question. It gets to one of the aspects I didn't address in my kind of a fast-forward version of the argument of the paper. So you're appealing to this, what epistemologists tend to call defeaters, right? So defeaters are considerations, roughly considerations that speak against belief, right? And we might have the intuition that, sure, maybe there are no kind of signs of trouble in the case as we specified it, but surely Larry would have to be such that were there to be such considerations, he would be sensitive to that, right? So we get kind of a hypothetical sensitivity on his part. And in the absence of that, we might feel that there's something fishy going on about something that would be preventing him from knowing, right? He's not sufficiently sensitive. Now, so Jennifer Lackey, for example, talks about these kinds of things in her book on testimony. And she says, for one, that if you don't have this sensitivity to defeaters, you can't know, right? Then you can't be a knower. But what's interesting is when she explains what's good about being sensitive to defeaters, what she says is that, well, if you're not sensitive to defeaters, then you're the kind of person that if you get it right, you're getting lucky. I'm paraphrasing it. That's not exactly what she said, right? So that's what's supposed to be bad about the insensitivity, right? That there's this luck in your and you're acquiring true belief insofar as you do it. Now, I think, and this is another kind of detail of the case that I didn't address here. So we imagine a case where Larry is not only such that he's surrounded by reliable sources in the actual words under the current circumstances, but we can imagine that even if circumstances were slightly different, so in philosophy speak, in nearby possible worlds, right? So imagine that maybe this source of that day were not available and so forth. So imagine that in that kind of, space of nearby possibilities, his sources are also reliable, right? And if that's the case, then we will not have, even if Larry is not such that were there to be considerations that arose that would count against belief, he wouldn't pick up on them. It would still not be lucky insofar as he achieved true belief. So the reason here, of course, is what does the work in the example of your study that way, is that we put the onus in terms of being sensitive to consideration speaking against belief, not on Larry, but on other people, right? Again, people in his surroundings. Just like in the original case, we put the onus of reliability in the actual world on his sources, and we can similarly put that onus on his sources in nearby possible worlds under slightly different circumstances than they are currently. So for the similar reasons as we talked about ruling out luck in other cases, insofar as we're interested in being sensitive to defeaters, we're interested in ruling out this kind of luck. But that kind of luck is not present in the case of Larry. He doesn't have the ability to himself to be sensitive to defeaters. We can assume. That's what makes his deference really blind, right? So that's the horn of your dilemma that we will be opting for here. Nevertheless, it's not clear why that would rob him of knowledge, because we have still ruled out the relevant kind of luck, not with reference to some feature of Larry, but with reference to some feature of his surrounding. So that's the idea. So that's what makes this still a case of blind deference while still being a candidate for virtue, because a candidate for knowledge. And then, of course, the challenge becomes, even if it is blind, there's supposed to be virtue. How do we account for that virtue? And then we're back where we ended a moment ago when we talk about social virtue. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like the work that a lot of people want this no defeater condition to do just gets sort of packed into the way you understand reliability in terms of nearby possible worlds.
There being this gets technical, but I'm talking about a modally robust form of reliability. So that just means that you have reliability in the actual world, low likelihood of forming false belief, and then you assume similar reliability across nearby worlds. So you can move around among nearby possibilities and still have reliability, right? So that's what's doing the work. And again, this is another instance. Instead of putting the onus on the individual, the onus in terms of realizing these things that we consider to be good, such as reliability, the onus is on the environment to secure that instead of the individual.
Yeah. Great. All right. So I want to talk about those social virtues in just a minute, but first I'm wondering about sort of the strength of your first claim that there is this virtue of blind deference. So initially it looks like you want to argue for what looks like a modest, though still substantial claim that there are some cases like this, some cases of blind deference, namely the kinds that you specify. What I'm wondering is what you think about a stronger thesis, namely that at least in all those cases of blind deference that meet your specifications, all those cases are cases of virtuous blind deference.
I would say that I would go. So for
do you go for the more general?
Under any conditions where you have the relevant kind of deference, you're deferring to others, and if the people that you're actually deferring to are reliable sources, so they tend to tell you things that are true, say, then you do have a virtue of deference. So in that sense, I'm arguing for the stronger claim. Now, I'm not arguing that all cases of deference are virtuous, just because you can. I'm not putting the requirement that your sources be reliable. I'm not packing that into the notion of virtue. So oftentimes it can be a terrible idea to defer to others. So obviously we can have there is some vice in the neighborhood here when you defer in the wrong way to the wrong people too often or something like that. But in every case where you are deferring and you're in the kind of social situation where that will enable you to form true belief, then you will have a virtue, and specifically social virtue, of blind deference. That's the idea.
And maybe we should talk more about these social virtues then. So I think I'll read a direct quote just to make sure I get this right. So at one point you say social virtues they're virtues possessed in whole or in large part, not on account of features internal to the psychology of the individual, but on account of features of her epistemic environment. And then the thought is that part of part of the matter of whether she's virtuous depends, on her environment, maybe a large part of that. And then something that follows from that you also say is that her virtue isn't something that's wholly explainable in terms of her internal features. It's partly dependent on her environment. And so now you might think, well, there are kind of maybe two notions of social virtue, one stronger than the other. The strong version, something like this, her virtue depends largely on her environment. The kind of more modest version, well, partly on her environment. And the reason I'm wondering about this is because it seems like for lots of virtues that we think of as just standard individual intellectual virtues like courage, for instance, those will depend at least partly on an agent's environment. They'll depend maybe on her upbringing or whether fears or threats present themselves or something like this. So I'm wondering what's needed to draw this distinction between social virtues and the kind of more standard individual virtues. Do we need it to be largely the case or mostly the case?
That's an excellent question. I think
it's an
important question.
Plays the crucial role there.
I guess two things about that. So first of all, one thing you're kind of pushing me on here is that it seems that there's vagueness sounds bad, but it seems that there might be some kind of gradability here. So something might be a social virtue to some extent. And to what extent? Well, to the extent that when you try to explain why the person involved is virtuous, you have to appeal to a smaller or greater extent to her social environment, right? So we can imagine. So the case of Larry is a very extreme case of deference, blind deference in particular. And the reason I think that's interesting to think about is because, of course, it's a very clean case. In Larry's case, you really see the contribution of his social environment. But I think at the same time, you can imagine less extreme cases. And I think when you imagine less extreme cases that nevertheless have a very significant contribution by the social environment, I think you get to more realistic cases, because I do think in many cases it will be the case that when we know things, we are heavily dependent on our social environment. So this is something talked about at the very top of this interview when we talked about social epistemology. So I think maybe this is a way to put it. I think virtue epistemology might have underestimated the extent to which we might be more like Larry than maybe like some paradigmatic case of an autonomous, self-sufficient, intellectually virtuous agent of the kind that we might have encountered in traditional virtue epistemology. But you're absolutely right, and this gets to another aspect of the question. You pointed out that if you look at discussions of virtue, of course, many virtue epistemologists have been sensitive to the fact that the social environment and the physical environment, so this is stuff we find, for example, in people like Greco and Sosa, plays a role in virtue ascription, right? And so that's absolutely right. So I guess what I'm trying to do, one way to think about what I'm trying to do in this paper and in thinking about social virtue in general, is I'm trying to suggest that it's not that I'm trying to introduce completely novel considerations into virtue epistemology, although I think it's fair to say that virtue epistemology maybe has been slower to acknowledge these factors than other parts of epistemology. But it's rather I'm trying to suggest that virtue epistemology hasn't been sensitive to the extent to which these types of factors play a role in us coming to know things and hence being virtuous, virtue being what is supposed to be accounting for that knowledge. Is that helpful at all in explaining, or? Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite helpful, both in sort of addressing the question and in situating your work in connection with the work of some other folks. It seems like one of the things you're doing is kind of making good on some of these promises or maybe fulfilling some of these longings that virtue epistemologists have expressed toward talking
I'm all
about
for
and
fulfilling
explaining the
longings.
role
That's
of
why I
these
got into
social
philosophy.
components of our intellectual
Okay, Nick. So,
lives.
so I think
That's all.
you've been very you've really indulged me here, and we've spent a lot of time talking about my stuff. So I'm thinking maybe we'll switch gears and we'll turn to some of your work on perseverance, if that sounds good to you. So thinking maybe we'll start off by you telling us a little bit about so what is this virtue of perseverance consist in?
Great. Yeah, so like some other intellectual character traits that get developed in the literature or treated in the literature, I think of intellectual perseverance as a character trait. So, and that's, at least for the purposes of this part of my work, I really am thinking of intellectual virtues as acquired, at least typically acquired character traits that require a kind of motivation for intellectual goods, and that arise in the pursuit of, or rather in the practice of intellectual inquiry and other intellectual activities. Perseverance, in particular, as a character trait, I think of as a disposition to continue in one's intellectual activities for an appropriate amount of time, with serious effort in the pursuit of intellectual goods, and despite obstacles to one's acquiring those intellectual goods or maintaining them or disseminating them. So in standard cases, we think of inquiry, right, getting at the truth, but I want to allow for cases of intellectual virtue that involve, keeping the truth, maybe remembering the truth, or disseminating the truth to others. And similar marks apply to knowledge. Now, that initial kind of characterization of perseverance as an intellectual virtue contains lots of subcomponents. So we've got continuing for an appropriate amount of time. Well, what's an appropriate amount of time? Serious effort. Why is that relevant? Despite obstacles to intellectual goods. So maybe I'll take a chance to unpack each of those subcomponents of the concept in a minute. First, I think it's helpful to note that perseverance as an intellectual virtue, like a lot of other virtues, is a mean between extremes. One of those extremes is an excess, the other is a deficiency. So it's a bit like courage in this respect. You might think, intellectually speaking, courage is a mean between intellectual cowardice on the one hand and something like intellectual rashness on the other. Likewise, I think of perseverance as a mean between, on the one hand, the extreme of irresolution, right, where that amounts to a disposition to give up far too early on one's intellectual projects. So that's the deficiency. Then there's this extreme on the other side that I call intransigence. That's the excess. Think of that as a matter of sort of going on too long, maybe in a project that you shouldn't have engaged in the first place, maybe going on in a project, where it's just time to quit, either because you're not making any progress, or you have good, strong reason to think that no progress is forthcoming, or something like that. So to think of paradigm cases of these vices, for intransigence, on the one hand, you might think of a student who quits working on paper after 5 minutes because it's just too much work to put forth this mild effort or something. Or in the case of intransigence, you might think of people who are continually looking for, the fountain of youth or El Dorado, or maybe people who are, trying to pursue the task of coming up with the mechanics for a perpetual motion machine. Or, these projects don't look like they're winners. Time to pack it in. So I think of perseverance as a mean between those extremes. And now there are several components that we've got to unpack to really spell out what we mean by that. The first of which is that perseverance requires persisting or continuing in one's intellectual endeavors for an appropriate amount of time. And then, of course, the question arises, well, how much time is appropriate? And there's no single answer, right? It's not going to be 6 hours or 12 days or something like this. There's no 90-day program such that if you fulfill it, you count as virtuously persevering. It's going to depend whether you persevere for an appropriate amount of time. It's going to depend on several factors. As a way to kind of group these factors together, we might appeal to this virtue called practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is what's going to tell you whether you've persisted for long enough to count as virtuously persevering, whether you haven't persevered long enough yet, or whether you should pack it in. But this appeal to practical wisdom, if we're not careful, I think could sound kind of vacuous. It's not as though there's just this magical thing you have, practical wisdom, and you suddenly see things. Now, practical wisdom is going to typically, always based on certain factors. So factors like this. What are the prospects for a project's success? Do we have a good chance of reaching the truth or gaining knowledge in this case? If the answer is yes, then practical wisdom, we'll count that as a consideration in favor of continuing. Another matter is the worth of the project itself, whether the worth to the individual agent, whether the worth to humanity as a whole. That will count in favor of continuing in a project. Another thing will be the opportunity cost of continuing in the project. So sometimes you might be engaged in a project that has good chances for success and it's pretty valuable, but you're doing it at the cost of something maybe with better chances for success or that would be far more valuable. Well, that's a factor that practical wisdom will have to consult. And then lastly, and this kind of links up some of my work to yours, there are certain social factors in play that can help determine whether an agent is virtuously persevering or not. So think about these two agents, right? Suppose we have two agents, both of whom are trying to cure some dread disease, cancer or AIDS or something like this. One of them sort of all on her own, without a lot of resources, and is in a position where it really doesn't look like she's going to help cure the disease on her own. She's not going to discover the cure on her own. The chances of that are just almost 0%. Well, in that case, I want to say she's intransigent if she continues, or at least there's a strong tendency to have the intuition in that direction. If, on the other hand, you take an agent in a similar position, right? She's not very likely to discover the truth on her own, but she is part of a community with maybe vastly better resources, not the least of which will be the intellectual resources of the other members of the community, such that the community as a whole is, at least in the long run, going to stand a decent chance of curing the disease, right? Discovering the cure. Then she can be virtuously persevering, even if she wouldn't be likely to get the truth sort of on her own. So I think those social factors are among the features that will determine whether the agent virtuously perseveres or not. Now, of course, these factors that I've just listed, though I think they're helpful, they don't provide an algorithm for practical wisdom to make its decisions. What they do is they show us the kinds of considerations that practical wisdom will consult. And then, of course, in any given case, those factors will be weighted differently. There'll be factors specific to the case such that, once they're consulted, practical wisdom will have more to go on. But in any case, I hope that those kinds of factors, or the appeal to those kinds of factors, make the appeal to practical wisdom seem at least somewhat informative rather than, just sort of a promissory note. Now there are these other bits of the definition of virtuous perseverance. So one of them is effort, right? Serious effort in the pursuit of one's intellectual goals. So though this notion of time spent is an important one, it's an important part of the concept of virtuous perseverance, it's obviously not the whole thing. And one reason for that is that you can persevere in a long time, or you can continue for a long time in an activity that's very, very easy, that doesn't require much effort at all. You can continue for a long time just by, lollygagging, right? You take much, much longer than you should to complete some project. Well, it's not such that if you continue for a long long time, that's going to be enough to count as virtuously persevering. Serious effort in addition to the time spent seems like it's a requirement. Another crucial requirement is that you have to be persisting in the face of obstacles, right? Things that make it difficult for you to achieve your intellectual aims. So think again of the person who just continues along in a very easy project. Well, that's not going to be at least a paradigm case of virtuous perseverance, because anyone can continue going along with an easy project. What makes perseverance a virtue is that it displays excellence, right? These virtues are excellences, and it takes a kind of excellence to persist despite obstacles that it doesn't take to persist where obstacles to one's intellectual success are not present.
Excellent.
So
thanks.
That's
really helpful. That's a really nice overview of the different conceptual components.
If there are details,
you mentioned at one point
that
there might be a social aspect to the way that perseverance works, and I wanted to return to that in a moment. But first, I just had a couple of quick questions about your characterization. So you talk about the virtue of perseverance as being a matter of continuing one's intellectual activity for an appropriate amount of time, and you very helpfully elaborated a bit on what the appropriate bit amounts to. But I was wondering, the fact that you kind of pack in the appropriateness in the definition of the relevant virtue would seem to have the following kind of claim come out to make no sense whatsoever. So if I say persevering for as long as I did was a bad idea. So it seems that if it's part of perseverance that you're doing it for the right amount of time, that kind of expression shouldn't be making sense. So I'm sure I'm just missing some part of your exposition here, but maybe it's helpful to say something about what that part is.
Yeah, sure. So I think here it can be helpful to draw a distinction between virtuously persevering and what I'll call, for lack of a better term, sort of merely persevering or merely persisting, merely continuing. So I think it makes perfect sense, kind of in ordinary language, to say, oh, it was a bad idea to persist as long as I did. In fact, when one says that, what one is saying is, I've been intransigent, right? I should have stopped. Well, if you've reported that, then you've in effect reported that you're not persevering in the virtuous sense. So I think drawing this distinction can help with that kind of case. To say that it didn't make sense to persist for as long as I did, or that was
right. That's really helpful.
Inappropriate.
Yeah.
That's just
another thing I was thinking about. So you think of, as many virtue epistemologists do, you think of virtue as in evolving, so specifically what you will call character virtue, as we've been talking about. That character virtue, a component of having that kind of virtue is that you are appropriately motivated, and specifically that you're motivated to roughly attain true belief or other epistemically good things like understanding and knowledge for their own sake or as such or something like that. Now I was wondering if you take character virtue to be requiring that kind of motivation, might it be the case that if you just think about, I don't know, I hope this doesn't just reflect on me, but if you think about what tends to motivate us, it seems that very rarely are we, at the very least, to the greatest extent when we do things, motivated by such noble motivations as opposed to other things like fame and money and everything else that brought us into philosophy in the first place. So what do you think about that? So do you think is character virtue a very rare thing, or am I exaggerating the kind of stringency of this motivation component?
Yeah, good. So all that's really helpful in sort of focusing our thinking about these virtues. So one thing I want to say, maybe this is important to say kind of as a way to bracket my project, is as I think of these virtues as character traits, that's not reflecting a kind of partisan theoretical choice between these character virtues on the one hand and what other people have called faculty virtues, where those amount to having reliable faculties like reliable sense perception and memory and reasoning. I don't think we have to choose between those different kinds of virtues. In fact, I'm inclined to think that kind of an all-encompassing virtue epistemology has room for both. So my project is really a choice of focus rather than a kind of theoretical choice. Now, you asked this good question, all right, might it turn out, given that many of us may not be so virtuously motivated, or at least those motivations might not be kind of at the forefront of consciousness as we pursue our intellectual lives, is it going to turn out that very few of us have these virtues? Maybe. It might be that way, but here's a way to kind of press back against that worry. Those who think of these motivations as necessary for character virtue don't necessarily think of them as the kind of thing that's at the forefront of your consciousness. You're not sort of consciously thinking about achieving the truth. These motivations might be the sort of thing that operate while you're in default mode. So that, I think, at least weakens the degree to which these character virtues, or talking about these Okay, so I think our call got dropped, so let's pick up where we left off. So I think I was about to talk about the extent to which focus on these intellectual goods needs to be exclusive in order for someone to count as virtuous. And what I want to say is not at all. They just have to be among the things that you're seeking in the course of inquiry. A nice case to illustrate this, I think, is the case of Helen Keller. And she's, to my mind, a paradigmatic case of perseverance in the virtuous sense. Keller is seeking to learn to communicate with her teachers. She's seeking to learn to grasp truths from those around her and communicate truths to those others. So intellectual goods are clearly a part of her motivation, but they're clearly not the whole of her motivation. She wants to improve her life. She wants to make it easier to get around in the world. She wants to find ways of getting the things that she needs. It'd be perverse, though, to suggest that because of those desires of hers, she's somehow less intellectually virtuous, right? So to kind of sum up response to your question, first, I don't think these sort of motivations need to be above the surface, at any rate not much of the time. And second, they don't need to have an exclusive monopoly on an agent's cognitive life.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Yeah. I was thinking, so you mentioned at one point at the very beginning when we spoke about this that the virtue of perseverance is a mean between two extremes, and then you illustrate in the paper you illustrated for us here too some examples of going wrong in either direction, right? And I was struck by one particular example that or actually two particular examples you work with in the paper. So one example of intransigence that you bring up is Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, trying to square the circle, right? That's supposed to be that's a dead end. You're not going to succeed. But then you have a case that you think is someone instantiating the virtue of perseverance, and that's the 16th century astronomer Tycho Brahe, right? Whose project was to try to square the old Aristotelian picture of the world with the kind of things that Copernicus had discovered about the universe. Brahe, of course, was mistaken in his acceptance of the Aristotelian bit, which is that the things orbit in a perfect circle. So he just wasn't able to get things to work, right, on account of that assumption. So it seems here, what I found interesting about putting these two cases next to one another is that it seems Hobbes couldn't succeed and Brahe couldn't succeed, right? So they were equally no matter how long they would have tried for, they wouldn't have succeeded. So on that account, why is Brahe still instantiating a virtue while Hobbes gets this rough end of the stick here? So why shouldn't we say about Brahe what we say about Hobbes, given that they both seem to be doing things that just can't be done?
Right. Excellent. That's a really helpful question. And I think it provides an opportunity to highlight something that's doing crucial work in the account, in keeping people from intransigence, in Brahe's case, or in moving them toward intransigence in Hobbes's case. And that's the reason to which they have, or the extent to which they have reason to think the projects can succeed. So Brahe, the doctrine of circular orbits, even in the kind of new heliocentric age, was still a live option. So he has reason to think that this Aristotelian doctrine of circular orbits can be squared with heliocentrism. He just needs to make some observations, a large number of observations, he thinks, and he thinks he can do it. And so what he does is, goes to all this trouble to build observatories, take these painstaking observations that he thinks will give him what he needs to square these two doctrines together. So he persists despite all these obstacles to inquiry because he's got good reason to think that the project can succeed. Hobbes, on the other hand, would seem to have really strong reason to think that the project is doomed to failure. And it's that strong reason to think that the project is doomed to failure that makes him intransigent. Whereas Brahe lacks such a reason. That's what allows him to persevere. So it's not mere failure. It's not even the inevitability of failure that makes something a pursuit intransigent. As a way to illustrate this kind of point, think about someone writing a philosophical paper, and suppose that the person is just doomed to be, unbeknownst to him, just doomed to be hit by a bus the day before he completes the paper. Right? He doesn't know this, but he's just doomed to fail to complete the paper. But puts in all this work, in all these days leading up to this tragic bus incident. Do we want to say that he fails to persevere just because, things don't end well, he doesn't complete the paper? Well, I want to say no. He's got reason to think he can complete this project all the way through. It seems like that's the sort of thing that matters, not the mere fact that he's going to fail, or not even the inevitability of failure. So I'm sorry if that was a grim example.
Okay.
I should have a cup of coffee before I.
No, that's yeah. Let's move on. Let's not think about that example too much. Then we'll be all worried when we try to finish our paper. No, that's really helpful, Nate. Yeah, this idea that really what matters is not so much the whether or not the project is doomed to failure, about whether you have good reason to believe that, say, on the other side, you have good reason to believe that you can succeed. So it's kind of the rationality of your beliefs about the likelihood of success that matters, rather than whether or not there's actual. That's really helpful. Okay, good. I was thinking we actually if we can stay with the Brahe case and also move to some of the stuff you mentioned earlier about the social aspect of perseverance. So of course, one reason we like Brahe, and one reason that he's so important when we look back in the history of science, is because the data that he provided, he wasn't able to complete his project because it couldn't be completed, but his data was later taken over by Kepler, who figured out that maybe it's not perfect circles, and then thereby he could jettison that Aristotelian assumption, and then we get a much better picture of the way the universe works. So there seems to be, insofar as we think that Brahe did something good, there seems to be a sense in which the reason we think that is not because something that he succeeded in, but because something that some later person, namely Kepler, succeeded in. So might it be the case, I'm wondering about the social aspect here, so do you think someone might, is it the case that someone might be made virtuous in his or her perseverance or persisting on account of consequences further into the future, maybe even for other people?
That's a good question, and I'm certainly open to that. In fact, I think if we think of virtue, intellectual virtue, along kind of consequentialist lines, right, the cognitive results of one's inquiry, then there will be a kind of extended sense in which these consequences make Brahe virtuous. I think something like that's quite plausible. In terms of my own account and thinking about intellectual perseverance as a virtuous character trait, I really am thinking of it as a kind of personal excellence, something that makes us admire a person. And though we might be glad about the results of Brahe's work, I don't think it's those results themselves that make us admire him as a person. Rather, it's, reading these accounts of the painstaking observations that he took, the extent to which he persisted in this task that he thought was really important. Those are the kinds of things that display cognitive excellence of the sort that count for or toward character virtue. Though, I'd be happy to discover another sense in which Brahe ends up virtuous on this other account of virtue. I'm certainly open to that.
Great. That's helpful. Yeah. Another thing I was thinking about here. So let's go back to. So let's stay with the social aspect here and the same example, and then we'll bring in what you said earlier about the kind of factors that practical wisdom will be sensitive to when deciding how long to keep trying for how long to persist. So you said one thing that practical wisdom will take into consideration is something like likelihood of success, what you have reason to believe. And that's what we got when we put Hobbes next to Brahe here. What reason to believe is likely to succeed. Now, here's a thought. I was wondering what you think about that. Now, I'm not a historian of science, so I might be getting this wrong, but so you said that, well, Brahe had good reason to believe that the Aristotelian assumption wasn't mistaken. Let's assume, so Kepler wasn't that far after Brahe, so it might have been the case that even at the time of Kepler, even Kepler had good reason to believe that assumption, right? So the idea that you were to jettison that assumption and work with some different assumption would actually be a real long shot, right? And you can imagine that in that respect, so here's a suggestion. Do you think in that respect, by simply going for what we have good reason to believe, given our current evidence or current situation, to succeed, are we going to be, is the virtue of perseverance going to make us risk averse in a way that might actually be detrimental to the kind of leaps that sometimes need to be made and have been made by a lot of people that we admire in the history of science. So do you think there is, so I think conflict might be too strong a word, but do you think there is a tension there between kind of individuals being persevering in a virtuous way, and then something like scientific progress, which might require that some people kind of go off on slightly crazy tangents and try out these ideas that we might not have
Yeah,
a
good,
lot of reason
good,
to think.
good. Yeah, that's
work
all
out. What
really
do you think
excellent.
about
And
that? Does that make
it
sense?
leads me to think I should clarify something about what I said earlier. So I do think, Brahe does have pretty good reason to think his project can succeed. I shouldn't have suggested, or at any rate, I didn't mean to suggest, that good reason to think your project will succeed is a requirement. I think that does keep Brahe from intransigence, but I think something weaker is required for avoiding intransigence. Maybe something like you've got to lack strong reason to think the project is just doomed, something like that. So that might help. That creates a lot more room for risk. There's another aspect of the account that creates room, namely the importance of the project itself. So right, it might turn out that if we just pick a bunch of easy projects, we'll succeed more often, but we won't discover all that much that's important. Well, there will be times, I think, when a project is so important, we really need to know the truth about how to cure some disease, for instance, that taking on a lot more risk of failure than one standardly would will be compatible with perseverance.
Excellent. Okay, great. I think we have been, you've been really generous with your time talking about your paper now, and I'm thinking maybe we should kind of round off by talking a little bit about, maybe you want to tell me a little bit about what you are thinking about working on in the near future within virtue epistemology. So what's kind of occupying your attention?
Great. Yeah, so
at the moment
something you
in the
said
near
at the
future.
outset of our discussion as a nice tie-in here. So you raised this worry, is it going to turn out, right, if the requirements for these virtues turn out to be, setting a pretty high bar, will these virtues turn out to be really rare? And then is that bad news for virtue epistemology? So there's been some recent work by folks like Mark Alfano and John Doris and Lauren Olin that I think is really interesting that lies in this direction. And so I'm interested in exploring both the extent to which empirical evidence supports the claim that these kinds of virtues really are rare, and then second, the extent to which the rarity of these virtues would turn out to be bad news for virtue epistemology, or whether maybe some could be incorporated. I suspect that one consideration that might make virtue epistemology less empirically committed than you might initially think is that not all cases of intellectual virtue are going to be paradigm cases. I want to think of the virtues as coming in degrees. So, not all of us are Helen Keller or Tycho Brahe, right? Very few of us possess intellectual virtue to that extent. Nevertheless, it might be that lots of us possess the virtues to some more moderate extent. So that seems, at any rate, like something that will need to be factored into those discussions. But I think some of the work that's already come out on these topics is just fascinating. And I'd like to ask what you're interested in continuing to work on, more on deference. I know you've done some other work in this field of virtue epistemology. Maybe you'd like to say a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. First, that sounds really interesting, what you're planning to work on. I look forward to seeing more about that in due course. One thing I am thinking about now, so when you said we talked about the virtue of deference, which you can think about as a virtue that implies to the hearer, so the person that is supposed to be listening to people who know what they're talking about, insofar as we're talking about the virtue of deference. So that's something like a hearer virtue. Recently, I've also been thinking, and I would like to think more about this in the near future, about virtues that might apply to speakers. So think about it this way, for example. So if there is such a thing as virtue of deference is something like listen to people who know what they're talking about. That seems to be a kind of virtue that we want to instill in people. Like we want people to have that virtue. That will be good from the point of view of people becoming and remaining informed. So how do you instill that virtue? And recently I've been doing some work suggesting that, well, basically what we want people to do in those kind of situations is listen, right? So we want them to. We have these sources that are informed. They're making a request. They're saying, listen, blah, 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 being something informative and true, right? So what we want to do is, in a sense, you can think about this as a problem of compliance, right? So when people fail to defer to the people that they should, we have a problem of compliance. They're not complying with the request for informed sources to be listened to, right? So that's the problem that's facing us insofar as we want to instill this virtue of deference in people. So how do we solve that problem of compliance? Well, there's a large literature in social psychology based on work by people like Tom Tyler, specifically looking at under what conditions people comply with the law, right? Another kind of request that please don't do these things. And then you look at when do people tend to adhere to those kinds of requests. And it turns out, it's a complex and detailed theory, but at the heart of it is this idea that very roughly people don't comply with requests out of fear of sanctions so much as when they perceive the command giver, if you want, or the authority to be just. And a very important component of the relevant kind of justice or perceived justice is that the people on the receiving end of the attempt of other people to want them to listen or comply is that they feel that they've been listened to themselves. So I put this in my paper in terms of that roughly people listen to people who listen, right? So what I'm hypothesizing here is that you might be able to solve the compliance problems you get when you're faced with people who don't listen to people who know what they're talking about. You might face that problem in a similar way. So very roughly, if you want people to listen to you, listen to them, right? And you might think about this, this gets back to some of the social stuff we talked about before. Insofar as you as a speaker are doing this, as far as you're prepared to provide your interlocutors with a forum for input, then you yourself are instantiating some kind of virtue, insofar as it's by doing so, you're instilling virtues of deference in others, and that will generate what we call in epistemology epistemic goods, so stuff like truth and knowledge. And that will reflect well on the speaker and might even suggest that it constitutes a kind of virtue. Not only a virtue on the part of the hearer, instantiates some kind of virtue of deference, but also some virtue associated with some kind of justice on the part of the speaker. So you have two kind of virtues working in tandem here for purposes of solving the problems posed by people not always listening to the people that they should. So that's one thing
that's fascinating.
Think more about
and
elaborate
more
on
about that
in the near future.
As for now, it looks like maybe it's time for us to wrap up, but I've really enjoyed our conversation. I'll hope to talk to you soon, Kristoffer.